The Valorian war fleet dropped out of hyperspace with 300 capital ships. Their cannons hummed with enough power to crack planets. Their soldiers numbered in the millions. They had come to claim the Threshold system, and nothing in the galaxy could stop them. Then they received a single transmission. It contained no threats, no demands, no warnings of reinforcements coming to defend the system. Instead, it held something far more disturbing: pages and pages of data. Casualty projections calculated down to the individual soldier. Economic collapse timelines showing exactly how the war would drain the Valorian treasury. Names of commanders whose children would grow up without fathers. Supply chain failures that would leave colonies starving within 8 months. At the bottom of the transmission was a single word: a signature. A code name that made the fleet admiral's blood turn cold. Silence 6 hours later. The greatest war fleet in Valorian history turned around and went home. They never fired a single shot. Cathrall read the intelligence report for the 15th time, and he still could not believe it. He was a young diplomatic attach, barely 30 cycles old, and he had spent the last 2 years of his life trying to understand one impossible human. His office was filled with contradicting reports, witness statements that made no sense, and questions that had no answers. Who was Silence? The galaxy's most feared operative had no face. No species knew her real name. Intelligence agencies from 12 different civilizations had tried to find her, and all of them had failed. Some reports said she was old, a veteran of forgotten wars. Others claimed she was young, barely an adult by human standards. Witnesses described her as tall, short, thin, heavy, dark-skinned, pale, scarred, beautiful. She was everything and nothing. A ghost made of rumors, but her results were very real. Cathrall counted 11 major conflicts that had ended because of her intervention. 11 wars stopped not by weapons or armies, but by single transmissions that somehow contained exactly the right information to make aggressors change their minds. She never killed anyone. She never commanded troops. She simply sent messages, and fleets retreated. The door to his office slid open, and Cathrall straightened in his chair. A summons drone floated in and projected the seal of the Conclave of Fiva, alliance of the galaxy's 5 ruling species. Diplomatic attached Cathrall, the drone announced. You will present yourself before the High Council immediately. The matter concerns the entity known as Silence. Cathrall's stomach tightened. He had studied Silence from a distance, but he never expected the council itself to take interest in his work. He gathered his files and followed the drone through the massive corridors of the central station, where representatives from 1,000 worlds conducted the business of governing the galaxy. The High Council chamber was a vast dome filled with floating platforms. Representatives from the 5 ruling species Valorian, Deshan, Dravani, Crethely, and Mordian watched as Cathrall took his place before them. You have studied the human operative, the Valorian High Commander said. His voice was cold and sharp. Tell us what you know. Cathrall swallowed his nervousness and spoke clearly. Silence has been active for approximately 15 standard years. In that time, she has intervened in 11 confirmed conflicts and possibly dozens more that we have not traced to her. Her methods are consistent. She gathers intelligence, extremely detailed intelligence, and delivers it to aggressors in ways that force them to see the full consequences of their actions. She threatens them, the Veshan ambassador said. No ambassador. That is what makes her different. She does not threaten. She informs. The Valorian fleet was not told they would be destroyed. They were shown exactly what their victory would cost. The choice to withdraw was their own. The council members exchanged glances that Cathrall could not read. This human has ended wars that our treaties could not prevent, the Dravani elder said slowly. She has more influence over military decisions than our entire diplomatic corps. And we do not even know her name. The Mordian representative leaned forward. Her dark eyes studied Cathrall like a predator watching prey. The question before this council is simple. Is Silence a threat to galactic stability? Cathrall hesitated. I do not have enough information to answer that question. Then you will find the information, the Valorian commander said. You are hereby assigned to locate and identify the operative known as Silence. Determine her true identity, her resources, her goals, and her methods. You have full authority to pursue this investigation wherever it leads. The weight of the assignment pressed down on Kethral's shoulders. He was being asked to find someone that the greatest intelligence agencies in the galaxy had failed to locate. And if I find her, then we will decide what to do with her, the Mordian said. Her tone suggested that the decision had already been made. Kethral spent 3 months following dead ends. False identities led to empty rooms. Witness accounts contradicted each other. Contacts who claimed to know something vanished before he could question them. It was like chasing smoke. Then he found a pattern that others had missed. Silence's interventions were not random. They clustered around certain regions of space areas that official maps showed as empty. When Kethral dug deeper, discovered that these empty zones contained something the Conclave did not want anyone to know about. Refugee settlements. Colonies of displaced peoples from wars the galaxy had tried to forget. One name appeared again and again in classified files. New Meridian, a human colony that officially did not exist. Kethral programmed the coordinates into his ship and made the jump. He expected to find a military installation or a hidden fortress. Instead, his sensors showed a small world with simple settlements and no defensive systems at all. Before he could scan further, a shuttle appeared on his screens. It was unarmed and small, barely larger than an escape pod. It positioned itself directly in his flight path. His communication system crackled, and a calm female voice filled his cockpit. "You are looking for Silence," the voice said. There was no fear in it, no anger. Just a tired patience that somehow made Kethral feel like a child who had wandered somewhere he did not belong. "I am," he replied. "Then you have a choice, diplomat. Turn back and report that you found nothing. Or come with me alone, leave your weapons on your ship, and see what you came to see. But know this, if you come, everything you think you understand will change." Kethral stared at the tiny shuttle on his screen. His orders were clear. His duty was to the Conclave, but something in that voice made him believe that the truth he had been sent to find was not the truth the Council wanted to hear. He powered, downed his weapons, and opened a channel. "We'll come alone." The shuttle turned and began leading him toward the planet below, toward answers that would shake everything he believed about power, peace, and what it truly meant to be strong. They didn't know her identity, only the code name that made fleets tremble. Part 2. The shuttle led Kethral down through thin clouds and over green hills that rolled toward a distant ocean. He had expected concrete bunkers and hidden weapon platforms. Instead, he saw farms, gardens, small houses with colored roofs scattered across the valley like wildflowers. Children ran through the streets below. And not all of them were human. Kethral's trained eyes spotted Valorian young playing alongside Thessian children. A group of Dravani teenagers sat in a circle with humans, laughing at some shared joke. Species that had fought wars against each other for centuries were living here together as if it were the most natural thing in the galaxy. The shuttle guided him to a simple landing pad near the center of the settlement. When Kethral stepped out, he was greeted not by soldiers, but by a human woman who looked like she had lived a long and difficult life. She was middle-aged, with gray streaking her dark hair and deep lines around her eyes. She walked with a slight limp, and her clothes were simple and practical, the kind worn by people who worked with their hands. Nothing about her suggested danger or power. "Welcome to New Meridian," she said. Her voice was the same one from the transmission. "My name is Mira. I coordinate things here." Kethral studied her carefully. "You're not what I expected," Mira smiled, and there was old sadness in it. "Expectations are dangerous things, diplomat. Come, I will show you what this place truly is." She walked slowly because of her limp, but she never complained or apologized for the pace. She simply moved forward, and Kethral followed. New Meridian was not a military base. It was a sanctuary. Medical tents treated patients from a dozen different species. Schools taught children in multiple languages. Community gardens grew food that fed thousands, Everywhere Kethril looked, he saw beings who had been broken by the galaxy working together to build something new. "How many refugees live here?" he asked. 12,000 at last count. Humans, Valorians, Deshans, Dravani, and others. All of them came from wars that the galaxy preferred to forget. She stopped at a small building where an elderly Crethily male sat on a bench, watching children play. His scales had faded with age, and one of his arms was missing below the elbow. "This is Elder Sothvan," Mira said. "He lost his entire clan during the Crethily purges. 87 family members. Gone in one night." The old Crethily looked up at Kethril with eyes that had seen too much suffering. "You wear conclave colors," he said. "The same colors worn by the soldiers who did nothing while my people died." Kethril did not know what to say. The Crethily purges were buried in classified files. The official story was that the Conclave had tried to intervene but arrived too late. Standing here, looking into this old man's eyes, Kethril began to wonder if that story was true. "I am sorry," he said. The words felt small and useless. Elder Sothvan studied him for a long moment. Then something in his expression softened. "The woman who saved Ushe says that sorry is only the beginning. What matters is what you do next." Mira led Kethril through more of the settlement. He met a Valorian deserter named Koth, who had refused orders to bomb civilian shelters. The military had sentenced him to death for treason. Humans smuggled him out before the execution. Now he taught engineering to young refugees, helping them build a future. He met a Veshan child named Lyra, whose parents had been killed by peacekeeping forces during a border dispute. She had been wandering alone in a burned city when a woman found her and carried her to safety. Now Lyra helped in the medical tents, learning to heal instead of hurt. Every person Kethril met had a story of survival, and woven through each story was the same thread: someone had saved them. A woman who appeared at the right moment, who wore different faces and different names, but who always did the same thing. She saw people that the galaxy had thrown away, and she chose to help them. "They all speak of the same person," Kethril said as evening approached. "But they describe her differently, because she needed to be different things to different people," Mira said. A Valorian officer to smuggle deserters past checkpoints. A Veshan merchant to bribe guards. A Dravani pilgrim to move through restricted zones. One woman cannot save 12,000 people as herself, so she became whoever she needed to be. They sat down for dinner in Mira's small home. The food was simple bread, vegetables, a thin soup, but it was warm and filling. The kind of meal that people shared when they had learned that survival mattered more than luxury. "Why did you let me come here?" Kethril asked. "I was sent by the Conclave. I could report everything I have seen." Mira set down her spoon and looked at him with those tired, wise eyes. "Because I wanted you to see the truth. Not the truth the Council wants, but the truth of what happens when powerful beings make choices without thinking about consequences and silence." "Is she here?" "You've been asking the wrong question all along, diplomat. You want to know who silence is? But the better question is, what does silence want?" Kethril frowned. "Power? Influence? Revenge against the Conclave? Is that what you see here? Power?" Mira gestured at the humble room around them. "Revenge?" He thought about the children playing in the streets. The old man who had lost everything but still found reasons to smile. The deserter who had chosen conscience over orders. None of it fit the picture of a dangerous enemy that the Council had painted. "I do not know what I see," he admitted. Mira smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. "Good. That means you are closer to understanding than most people ever get." That night, Kethril lay awake in the small guest room Mira had prepared for him. Something about this place about her did not fit together. He was trained to read people, and Mira moved like someone who carried heavy secrets. He slipped out of bed and accessed his ship's databanks through a secure connection. It took him hours to crack the encrypted archives, but he finally managed to run Mira's biometric data through the Conclave's identification systems. One result came back. A file marked classified at the highest level, Dr. Mira. Okonkwo, human, former humanitarian aid coordinator for the Galactic Council, assigned to refugee operations during the Crethely Purges. Status: killed in action. 15 standard years ago, Kethril stared at the screen. The woman who had welcomed him into her home, who had shown him this impossible sanctuary, was officially dead. She had been dead for 15 years, but she was very much alive, and somehow she had built something that made the galaxy's mightiest. Fleets tremble at the sound of a single word. When dawn light crept through his window, Kethril knew that everything the Council had told him was wrong. The question was no longer whose silence was. The question was whether he was brave enough to learn why she had to exist at all. They didn't know her identity, only the codename. That made fleets tremble. Part 3, Kethril found Mira at dawn. Working in a small garden behind her house, she knelt in the dirt, carefully transplanting seedlings with hands that had clearly done this work many times before. She did not look up when he approached, but she knew he was there. "You searched for me," she said. "It was not a question. You were supposed to be dead." Kethril stood over her, his mind still struggling to connect the official record with the woman before him. Dr. Mira Okonkwo, killed during the Crethely Purges. Your file is sealed at the highest level. Mira set down her gardening tool and slowly rose to her feet. Her limp was worse in the morning, and she winced as she straightened her back. When she finally looked at him, there was no fear in her eyes, only the deep exhaustion of someone who had carried impossible burdens for far too long. "I was killed," she said quietly. "Or at least, the woman I used to be died that night. What came after is something different." She gestured for him to follow, and they walked together to a small hill overlooking the settlement. Below them, New Meridian was waking up. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children's laughter drifted on the morning breeze. It looked peaceful, but Kethril now understood that this peace had been built on unimaginable sacrifice. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me everything." Myra sat down on the grass and stared at the horizon. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of memories she could never forget. 15 years ago, I was a humanitarian coordinator for the Galactic Council. My job was to help refugees to document crises, coordinate aid, save lives. I believed in the system. I believed that if the Council knew what was happening, they would act. She laughed bitterly. "I was young and foolish." "The Crethely Purges," Kethril said. "Yes, the Mordians wanted Crethely territory. The other species did not want to risk war with the Mordians, so they looked away. They made excuses. They delayed and debated while villages burned and families were slaughtered, their hands tightened into fists. I was there. I saw everything. I documented the massacres. I sent report after report to the Council, begging them to intervene. Do you know what they did?" Kethril shook his head. "They sealed my reports, classified them, ordered me to evacuate and never speak of what I had witnessed." Her voice cracked with old anger. "They wanted me to pretend that 80,000 deaths were an acceptable price for political stability. But you did not leave." "I could not." "There were survivors hiding in the ruins, children, elderly, wounded. They had nowhere to go. So I stayed. I tried to smuggle them to safety, one group at a time." She touched her leg where the limp slowed her steps. "The Mordians found out. They sent mercenaries to clean up the witnesses. I took 3 bullets trying to protect a family of refugees. The mercenaries left me for dead in a burning building." Kethril felt something cold settle in his chest. The Council had abandoned her. They had left her to die rather than risk political complications. "Human smugglers found me," Mira continued. "Illegal traders who had been running supplies to the refugees. They pulled me from the rubble and brought me to a ship. I spent 4 months in a medical bay learning to walk again, learning to live with what I had seen." "And then you became silence." Mira turned to look at him. "Not right away. First, I just wanted to help the survivors. I used the smuggling networks to build this place, New Meridian, a home for everyone the galaxy had thrown away." She stood and began walking slowly back toward the settlement. Kethril walked beside her. But helping refugees was not enough. The wars kept coming. More purges. More genocides. More displaced children with nowhere to go. I realized that I could spend my entire life pulling people from burning buildings. But it would never stop unless someone changed how the powerful made their choices. So you found another way. I spent years learning. Every species has different psychology, different values, different pressure points. The Valorians value honor and legacy. The Ascients fear economic ruin. The Dravani cannot bear the thought of their family lines ending. The Mordians care only about power, but power depends on stability. She stopped and faced him directly. The powerful do not respond to morality, diplomat. They respond to consequences. They will ignore 1,000,000 deaths if those deaths do not touch them personally. So I decided to make it personal. The transmissions, Kethril said. Understanding was beginning to form in his mind. You do not threaten them. You show them. Exactly. I gather intelligence, the kind that no one else bothers to collect. Not military positions or weapon counts, but the things that matter to individuals. Their children's names, their parents' graves. The exact economic cost of their wars, down to the last credit. The names of every soldier who will die matched with the names of families who will mourn them. She reached out and touched Kethril's arm. I do not tell commanders that I will destroy them. I show them what they will destroy themselves. I make them see the faces of the people they have decided do not matter. And then I let them choose, and they choose to stop. Most of them, not because they are afraid of me, but because they are afraid of themselves. Most beings are not truly evil, diplomat. They are simply distant from the consequences of their decisions. When you force them to serially see what their choices will cost, many of them discover that they cannot live with those costs. Kethril was quiet for a long moment. Everything he had been taught about power and strength was being rewritten in his mind. The Conclave believed that silence was a military threat, an enemy to be neutralized. But she was something far more dangerous. She was a conscience. A mirror that forced the galaxy to look at itself. The Council fears you, he said. They think you want to control them. Mira laughed, and it was the saddest sound Kethril had ever heard. Control? I live in a two-room house and grow vegetables. I have no army, no wealth, no political power. All I have is information and the willingness to use it. That is enough to make fleets retreat. Yes, and that is what terrifies them. Not my power, my example. If one tired old woman with a limp can stop wars with nothing but truth, then what does that say about all their armies and treaties and grand alliances? She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering and still chose hope. You came here to find out if I am a threat. Now you know the answer. The question is, what will you do with that knowledge? Kethril opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, alarms began wailing across the settlement. Both of them looked up to see lights flashing on the communication tower at the center of town. Myra's face went pale. No, not yet, she ran, as fast as her limp would allow to the tower. A young human technician met them with fear in his eyes. A Conclave strike fleet just entered the system, he said. 12 warships. They followed the diplomat's signal here. Kethril felt the blood drain from his face. He had been so careful to cover his tracks, but the Council had been watching him the entire time. They had used him as bait. The communication screen crackled to life, and a harsh Valorian voice filled the air. Attention, New Meridian. We know you harbor the terrorist known as Silence. You have 6 hours to surrender her, or we will pacify this settlement. There will be no negotiation. Myra stared at the screen. 12,000 refugees. Children playing in the streets. Elderly survivors who had already lost everything once. 6 hours to save them all, she said quietly. And somehow she managed to smile. I suppose it was too much to hope that the truth would set us free without a fight. She turned to Kethril. You have a choice now, diplomat. You can return to your ship and tell them you were my prisoner. They will believe you. Your career will survive, and if I stay, then we try to save 12,000 lives with nothing but words, and we probably fail. Kethril looked at the settlement below, at the children who were being hurried toward shelters, At the old, crethly elder who had lost everything and still found reasons to hope, he thought about who he wanted to become. "Tell me what to do," he said. They didn't know. Her identity, only the code name that made fleets tremble. Part 4. The 12 warships hung in orbit like predators, waiting for their prey to stop running. Their weapons could reduce New Meridian to ash in minutes. Their commander had given 6 hours, but everyone knew that deadline was a formality. The Conclave did not negotiate with terrorists. In the settlement below, organized chaos had taken over. Parents gathered their children. Medical staff prepared emergency shelters. The few security personnel New Meridian possessed handed out emergency supplies, knowing that their small arms would be useless against orbital bombardment. But in a small room at the heart of the communication tower, Mira was not preparing for battle. She was preparing something else entirely. "I have spent 15 years building intelligence networks across the galaxy," she said, her fingers flying across multiple screens. "Every species has informants who owe me favors. Every military has officers who have given me secrets not because I paid them, but because they trusted me to use those secrets wisely." Kethril watched her work with growing amazement. Data streamed across her screen's personnel files, family records, financial histories, personal messages. It was the kind of information that intelligence agencies would kill to possess, and she had gathered it all without armies or threats. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "The same thing I always look for. The people behind the uniforms." She pulled up an image of a stern Valorian in Admiral's insignia. "Fleet Commander Voss. He ordered this mission. Decorated officer, 40 years of service, personally recommended by the High Council. He sounds like a true believer. On the surface, yes. But his son died 3 years ago in the Threshold campaign, the same conflict I helped end. His private journals, which he thinks no one has ever read, show that he blamed the Conclave for sending his son into an unnecessary war." She switched to another profile. "His executive officer is Commander Thesa. Thesian, career military, completely loyal to the chain of command. But her sister runs a refugee hospital on the Outer Rim. That hospital received anonymous funding for the past 8 years. She does not know where the money came from. It came from me." One by one, she built profiles of every senior officer in the fleet. The weapons officer whose parents had been refugees themselves, the communications chief who had lost faith in the Conclave after witnessing corruption during his first assignment, the young lieutenant whose brother had deserted rather than participate in a massacre, and who had been wondering ever since if his brother made the right choice. "These are not evil people," Mira said. "They are soldiers following orders, doing what they believe is right. But every one of them has doubts. They have never spoken aloud. Every one of them has asked themselves, in the quiet moments, whether this is truly who they wanted to become. If you want to reach them directly, I want to give them permission to listen to those doubts, to ask the questions they have been afraid to ask." Kethril studied the data with new eyes. He had been trained in diplomacy, in the art of negotiation between governments and factions. But this was something different. This was diplomacy aimed at the human heart, or rather, the hearts of a dozen different species, all unified by the same fundamental needs and fears. "How can I help?" he asked. Mira handed him a tablet. "You know Valorian culture better than I do. Help me craft the messages for Commander Voss and his bridge officers. They need to hear the truth in words that will resonate with their values." For the next 4 hours, they worked together. Kethril discovered that Mira's genius was not in the information she gathered, but in how she used it. She did not write threats or demands. She wrote letters, personal, honest letters that spoke to each recipient as an individual rather than an enemy, to Commander Voss. She wrote about his son, not accusing him of anything, but simply acknowledging the loss and asking whether this mission would honor his son's memory or betray everything his son had believed in, to the weapons officer. She sent images of the refugee children who would die if she fired, not as emotional manipulation, but as simple truth. "These are the faces. These are the names. They are real," to the communications chief. She asked a single question. "When you joined the military, Was this what you imagined you would be doing? We cannot send these directly to the fleet, Kethral said. They will block any transmissions from the surface. Amira smiled. The first genuine smile he had seen from her since the crisis began. I have spent 15 years preparing for a moment like this. Do you think I would leave something as important as communication to chance? She activated a hidden system, and suddenly Kethral's screens filled with connection confirmations. Sleeper programs embedded in the fleet's systems years ago. Informants on a dozen ships waiting for her signal. Encrypted channels that bypassed every security protocol the Conclave had ever designed. Being invisible has its advantages, she said. No one thinks to guard against someone who officially does not exist. At the 5-hour mark, Mira launched the messages. Each one was personalized, timed to reach its recipient during a moment of privacy. Each one asked questions instead of making demands. Then she did something that surprised. Even Kath's single quotes are, A. She broadcast her face. For 15 years, silence had been a ghost name without a face, a legend without a form. Now, for the first time, Mira Okonkwo let the galaxy see who she really was. A tired woman with gray hair and a limp. Someone who looked like a grandmother, not a warrior. My name is Mira, she said in the broadcast. 15 years ago, I was left for dead because I tried to save refugees. Today I am asking you to do something the Conclave never did. I am asking you to see the people you have been ordered to destroy. She transmitted images from New Meridian. Children playing. Elderly survivors sharing meals. Former enemies working side by side to build something beautiful. These are not terrorists. They are the people your governments threw away. I gave them a home. That is my crime. The broadcast ended and silence fell over the communication room. All they could do now was wait. On the flagship, Commander Voss read Mira's letter 3 times. His hands trembled. His son's face floated in his memory, young, idealistic. Dead at 23 in a war that had achieved nothing, junior officers huddled in corridors, showing each other the messages they had received. Conversations that should never have happened began spreading like fire through the fleet. The weapons officer stared at the targeting console and saw faces instead of coordinates. At 6 hours exactly. Commander Voss opened a channel to his fleet. Prepare firing solutions on New Meridian, he ordered. His voice was steady, but something in his eyes had changed. All ships stand ready to execute on my command. On the surface, the few small ships that New Meridian possessed unarmed transports. Cargo shuttles, refugee vessels launched into space. They positioned themselves between the settlement and the fleet. Their pilots were volunteers. Human, Valorian, the Shan, Dravani. Former enemies standing together as living shields. They knew they would die if the fleet opened fire. They launched anyway. Commander Voss watched them on his screen. Unarmed ships crewed by refugees, placing themselves in front of his weapons. Sir, his weapons officer said. Her voice cracked. Targeting solutions are ready? Voss closed his eyes. He saw his son's face again. He saw the images of children from Mira's broadcast. He saw the unarmed ships floating peacefully in his firing line. Piloted by people who had already survived horrors he could barely imagine. He gave the order. Fire. His weapons officer stood from her console. No, sir. Voss turned to face her. That is a direct order, Commander. I know, sir. She stood at attention, her face pale but determined. I will accept whatever punishment you decide, but I will not kill children today. Around the bridge, other officers rose from their stations. The communications chief, 2 navigation officers, a young ensign who had been crying quietly since reading his message. Within minutes, a third of the fleet had declared that they would not participate in the attack. Ships that had been ready to destroy a world now sat with powered-down weapons, their crews wrestling with questions they had never been brave enough to ask Commander. Voss stood alone at the center of his fractured fleet. The legend of silence had always seemed impossible, one woman stopping wars without firing a shot. Now, he understood how she did it. She did not defeat her enemies. She helped them defeat themselves. They didn't know her identity, only the codename. That made fleet's Tremble Part 5 Commander Voss stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched his fleet fall apart. 3 ships had withdrawn entirely, their captains citing mechanical problems that everyone knew were lies. 4 more had declared themselves neutral, refusing to participate but unwilling to openly mutiny. His remaining vessels had enough firepower to destroy New Meridian 10 times over, but their crews were scattered with doubt, like cracks spreading through glass. He had spent 40 years building a reputation for decisive command. He had won battles that lesser officers could not have imagined. And now he was being undone by a middle-aged woman with a limp and a handful of letters. The worst part was that she had not threatened him. She had not tried to manipulate or deceive him. She had simply told him the truth and asked him to look at it. His son's face haunted him. Young and bright and full of hope, cut down in a war that everyone now agreed had been pointless. The Conclave had sent thousands of sons and daughters to die for political convenience, and Voss had never questioned it. He had told himself that orders were orders, that duty was duty, that someone had to make the hard choices. But standing here now, looking at a world full of refugees who had already lost everything, he could not escape the question Mira had planted in his mind. Would his son have wanted this? Would his son have been proud of the man he had become? He opened a private channel to the surface. Mira's face appeared on his screen. She looked exhausted, like someone who had been running for 15 years and never had a chance to rest. But her eyes were clear and steady. "Commander," she said simply. "You win," Voss replied. His voice was heavy with defeat, but there was something else in it too. Something that might have been relief. "My fleet is broken. I cannot fire without tearing my own command apart. I did not want to win anything, Commander. I just wanted you to see. See what? That I am a monster for following orders." Mira shook her head slowly. "You are not a monster. Monsters do not feel guilt. They do not hesitate. They do not wonder if they are doing the right thing." She leaned closer to the screen. "I looked into your service record. You saved 300 civilians during the Threshold campaign. You risked your career to prevent a massacre. That is not the action of a monster." Voss felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. He had spent so long trying to forget the doubt, trying to be the perfect soldier the Conclave wanted him to be. He had buried his conscience so deep that he thought it was gone forever, but it was still there. Mira had simply helped him find it again. "What happens now?" he asked. "If I stand down, the Council will destroy my career. They may execute me for treason," maybe Mira admitted. "Or maybe you become the first example of something new. The first officer who chose conscience over orders and survived to tell the story." She smiled, and for a moment, she did not look tired anymore. She looked like someone who had finally seen a glimpse of the future she had spent 15 years fighting for. "The galaxy changes one choice at a time, Commander. Today you made yours. Tomorrow, someone else will see what you did and find their own courage. That is how we build a better universe. Not with weapons or treaties, but with individual acts of moral bravery that inspire others." Voss was silent for a long moment. Then he straightened his shoulders and stood at attention, not for the Conclave, but for something higher. "Fleet orders," he announced over the open channel. "All ships stand down. We are returning to Central Station for debriefing. There will be no action against New Meridian today." The confirmations that came back were mixed with relief, confusion, and something that sounded almost like gratitude. Whatever happened next, these officers would never forget the day they chose not to fire. 6 months later, Kethrel stood before the Conclave of 5 and delivered his final report on the entity known as Silence. The council chamber was packed. Word of the New Meridian standoff had spread across the galaxy, and everyone wanted to know the truth about the mysterious figure who had stopped a war with nothing but words. "Silence is one woman," Kethrel said clearly. "Her name is Dr. Mira Okonkwo. She is a former humanitarian coordinator who was officially killed 15 years ago during the Crethely purges." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. The representatives leaned forward in their seats. "She has no military resources, no weapons, no political power. Her only tools are information and the willingness to use it. She stops wars by forcing aggressors to see the full human cost of their choices, and then she lets them decide whether they can live with those costs. The Mordian representative cut in sharply. She is a terrorist who undermines legitimate military operations. She is a conscience, Cathrell replied. And perhaps it says something troubling about our conclave, that we needed an outsider to provide one. The chamber erupted in angry shouts and demands for order. But Cathrell noticed something else too. Some of the younger diplomats were nodding. Some of the observers looked thoughtful rather than outraged. The old certainties were beginning to crack. The debates that followed lasted for months. Some demanded that Mira be arrested and tried for interference with military operations. Others argued that her methods should be studied and perhaps even adopted. The conclave, for the first time in decades, was truly divided not along species lines, but along philosophical ones. In the end, a compromise was reached. New Meridian was granted protected status as a humanitarian settlement. No fleet would approach without invitation. The refugees who had built lives there were finally safe, but Myra's greater victory was quieter and more profound. Across the galaxy, young diplomats and military officers began asking questions that had never been asked before. What if we tried to understand our enemies instead of destroying them? What if we measured victory by lives saved rather than battles won? What if one person's courage could change everything? They called themselves Voices. They studied Mira's methods and adapted them to their own situations. They built networks of understanding that crossed species boundaries and political divisions. They were not always successful. They tried, and sometimes trying was enough. On New Meridian, Myra sat in her garden as the sun set over the hills. She was older now, and tired in ways that rest could not fix. Her limp had gotten worse, and some mornings it took her an hour just to get out of bed. But when she looked at the settlement below, the lights coming on in windows, the sounds of families gathering for dinner, she felt something that had been missing for most of her life. Peace. A young Valorian girl came running up the path, carrying a steaming cup of tea. She was one of the refugee children who had arrived during the standoff, forephoned, frightened, with nowhere else to go. Now she was 12 years old and learning to smile again. Grandmother Myra, she said, using the title that many of the children had adopted. Is it true that you are the legendary Silence? Mira took the tea and wrapped her cold hands around the warm cup. She considered the question carefully, as she considered all questions. Silence was never one person, she said finally. It is what happens when someone decides that understanding matters more than winning. When someone chooses to see the faces of strangers and recognize them as family. When someone is brave enough to ask hard questions and patient enough to wait for honest answers. She reached out and gently touched the girl's cheek. You can be silenced too if you want. Anyone can. That is the secret that the powerful have never understood. The girl nodded solemnly, then ran back down the path to join her friends. Mira watched her go with eyes that had seen too much suffering and still believed in hope. Across the galaxy, fleets still hesitated when they received unsigned transmissions. Commanders who once would have fired without question now paused to consider the consequences. The legend of Silence had grown beyond anything one woman could have created because it was never about one woman. It was about the radical idea that every being in the universe deserves to be seen, that every life has value, that even enemies can become friends if someone is brave enough to treat them as people instead of targets. The galaxy was not fixed. Wars still happened. Injustices still occurred. But something had changed in the fundamental fabric of how beings related to each other. A seed had been planted, and it was growing. Mira sipped her tea and watched the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, young voices were having conversations that would change the course of history. Somewhere, a commander was choosing mercy over orders. Somewhere, a refugee was finding hope. She had spent 15 years fighting an impossible battle. Now finally, she could rest not, because the battle was won. But because she was no longer fighting alone, the legend says that silence is everywhere. The truth is simpler and more beautiful. Compassion, once planted, spreads, and the galaxy had finally begun to listen.